Okay. People are coming in. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. So you don't celebrate Thanksgiving in Israel?
Well, actually, I mean, as a Canadian, I think we have Thanksgiving in Canada. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's not the same.
It's in October, though.
It's in October. But the American Thanksgiving, my wife's American, my kids are American. So we generally every year will have a Thanksgiving dinner, not this year, with probably 3 couples or so, maybe 10, 12 people, although our kids are all older, so they're kind of scattered all over the world literally these days. But yeah, most expats, American Israelis, have some sort of form of Thanksgiving.
Wait,
Kids come from far away.
How do you say turkey in Hebrew?
You'd actually say Tarnagol or Tarnagol Hodu.
Hodu, right?
Right.
Which is
versus, this is where it gets confusing. So Hodu is the bird, Hodu is the country India, and Turkiya is the country Turkey in Hebrew. It's really weird. I don't know
But
why.
also Hodu comes from Todah.
Oh, so you think there's a linguistic connection between Thanksgiving and
Turkey? I'm going to talk about that. So I wanted to, I was pretty sure that was correct, but
Hodu Ladonai. The
right.
problem is you may be having some vegans and vegetarians in your crowd, Rabbi. You got to be careful.
Well, I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about the interesting, it's just interesting linguistically to see that. I'm talking about Judaism and Thanksgiving and what connections there might be. So
it makes me think of, again, my wife is vegan, so she would make a vegan supplement. I don't know what she would make, something that would.
My daughter's vegan, so we're not
turkey. But I was wondering, apropos Hodu and Thanksgiving and giving thanks in Jewish tradition, same with the temple. Like, what did our ancestors do? There must have been vegetarians and vegans 2,000 years ago. But how would they approach an animal sacrifice in the temple?
Could bring first fruits, and you could bring the ephah, you could bring a cake, you could bring vegan things.
It's true. But there are certain things that have to be.
Eric David says, what did he say? His family's Hollander. He said,
German.
My mother's family were Hollanders from Aachen.
Well, hello. Hi, Eric. How are you? Pleased to meet you. I do not know my name, obviously, from my father's side, Hollander. And my father's father was either born in Poland or in London, just toward the end of the 19th century. So my grandfather, I guess I would say. And we don't know where the family came from, but there are not a small number of Hollanders in Germany. The maiden name I know of Anne Frank's mother was Hollander as well. So it's not an uncommon name. And as I mentioned last week, I talked about Sfarad in Spain. It's quite possible that Hollander is originally a Sephardic name that comes from the Jews who were kicked out of the Iberian Peninsula end of 15th century, immigrated to Holland, where things were much more liberal, and then eventually ended up in Germany and Poland or wherever. So we could be related, but I can't see a picture, but you do look almost as if, I think I've seen you, Eric. It wasn't at Wilshire Boulevard, it was at Sinai, if I'm not mistaken. Not that Sinai, the one, in the desert town.
Saw you in Sinai. Actually, in America, there's a website for Jewish singles to meet called Saw You at Sinai.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a new one. Is it like particularly Orthodox traditional or not necessarily?
No, it's not at all.
Because not all young Jews looking for life partners are necessarily aware of that Sinai.
Yeah, well, I don't think I don't think so. I think it's anyone who knows. It's just a Jewish, I'm sure maybe. Anyway, so hi everyone, good morning. We're here with Mike Hollander on our 4th and final for now trip, European Jewish journey. We're going to Berlin, where I actually went with my daughter in person, not this past summer, but the summer before. And we stayed actually in East Berlin on Karl Marx Platz in a Airbnb, which was cool. And saw a lot of it, saw everything. So we can talk about that after. And then this is our last programming, lunchtime and morning time programming until January. We're taking off December, except for Music Matters and Torah study every Friday. And I just want to say that we're going to be doing 8 nights of Hanukkah programming every single night. It's called 8 Crazy Nights. You can see it on our website. You can sign up. Just means we know how many are coming, but there's family programming, adult programming, all kinds of stuff every night. And we'll light Hanukkah candles together as well. So we want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving. Just talking about that. And it's 9:35. So Mike, I'm gonna let you take it away. And I'll thank you now. I'll thank you after. We can't thank you enough for these wonderful lectures and trips and information and learning. And we're gonna do more of it in the spring. We're gonna go to Israel but see it from a very unique perspective. And that'll be a lot of fun and very interesting as well. So thanks so much, Mike. We really enjoyed it. And
Pleasure.
I'm gonna just get off now and let you take over. And I'll see you after.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you, Rabbi. We were talking about Thanksgiving. I will also say that at the beginning, the Rabbi and I were talking about a internal debate that I have when I make these presentations between kind of information, knowledge, and themes and visuals. And what I hope, because the Rabbi was saying that she was looking at beautiful visual videos of Cordoba, which are easily accessible on the internet. I hope that after my sessions, that it inspires you to do more of your own research. And there's just so much that is out there. I mean, 10 years ago, if I would have made these presentations based on my traveling to these sites and based on my own library, it would have been hard pressed to have the visual access and to information and the visual images that one has now on the internet. And Google Jewish Cordoba, or Google the top 10 things to see in Sevilla or Granada. You go on visual tours. I've been on many visual tours of museums, whether it's the Prado Museum in Madrid. I visited a couple of times the past year, but I visited virtually Chicago Art Institute. There's just so much that is out there. So I hope that these sessions are, and I know, and I've gotten a lot of feedback, a lot of information packed in a short 75 minutes, but hopefully they'll inspire you to do more of your own independent online research. So we are going to Berlin, as the Rabbi said. I should say that the first time I was in Berlin, maybe a decade ago now, I had a little bit of anxiety / trepidation, to say the least, because after all, Berlin is Berlin. And Berlin has had a lot that happened in Berlin, both positive and negative. And I will say that our middle child, our daughter, who's 25 now, when she went into the army, so 6 years ago, we started a tradition when my eldest went into the army 2 years before that, that one of the parents would go with them to Europe. So my son came with me, and he tagged on to a group that I had of 12 days across Europe, and the last 3 days were in Berlin. He joined me for Berlin, and then we went and spent a week together in Italy. My wife and my daughter deciding where to go, and I said, you really should go to Berlin. And my wife said, why do I want to go to Berlin? I mean, in the late 70s, when I was a teenager backpacking across Europe, I was in Munich and a few other places, and I just felt as a Jewish teenage girl from New York in the 70s, not very comfortable there. I said, go to Berlin. Berlin is different. Berlin is kind of to Germany like New York or Los Angeles is to the rest of America. It is America, but it's also not all of America. Berlin is representative of Germany, but it's not just representative. I mean, but not all Germany is necessarily Berlin. It's an amazing place, the biggest city in continental Europe. I think it's 3.5 million people, huge city in terms of geographic size. And what we're going to do in the next hour and change is talk about the rise and fall of German Jewry, just in Berlin, I should say, because we could go to West Germany, the western part of Germany, and go to an area called the Schum cities, 3 cities, Speyer, Mainz, and Worms, which were major Jewish communities 900, 1,000 years ago. But we're going to look at Berlin, very short period, really, from about the beginning, or the mid, I should say, 18th century until 1933, and then, of course, the Shoah, and then afterwards. And I've called it, I'm from Success, and there's an image of Moses Mendelssohn on the right-hand side. We'll talk a lot more about him, to Shoah, to Rebirth. Excuse me, and the picture on the left-hand side is a picture I took, I think last time I was in Berlin, or 2 trips ago. And by the way, Berlin is the last city I was in outside of Israel in February with a group from Chicago. And this is an image taken from the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, an amazing memorial built by an American artist, Eisenman. And I noticed afterwards, and it came up on my iPad after I took it on my iPhone, that it's a very thought-provoking image because it looks almost as if there's a Star of David. And I put that up there because I think there's a lot of visual stuff that I'm going to be showing you that particularly grapples with the third part of my presentation, and that is 1945 to the present. So you might remember we were in Spain, I want to say last week, in Russia 2 weeks ago, and a month ago we were in Poland, and I started off the series of European virtual journeys speaking about Abraham and a journey. But I also suggested in Poland, in my first presentation, that we remove our glasses and we put on a new set of lenses through which to experience this site or this place Jewishly. And in this case, I want you to look at a three-sided prism. In Poland, it was 1,000 years of Jewish life. In Berlin, we're really only talking barely about 300 years of Jewish life, which was a kind of meteoric rise from barely being allowed into the city with having significant quotas and having to pay a tax, to really being at the kind of upper echelons of society, much like Jews feel today in America, I think, and much like Jews felt in Spain until 1492. The second side of the prism is the Shoah, the Holocaust, 1933 to 1945. Here, Poland, it was only 39 to 45. But Berlin, I think, has a much deeper part of the Shoah story because, of course, this was the center of governance under Hitler, and this is where he first kind of took over the reins of power in 1933. So we'll talk briefly about that. And then we'll talk, and I think in this case, perhaps the most complicated, but perhaps also the most positive looking and positive feeling and most inspirational part, and that is 1945 to the present. And you'll see when I kind of break them down a little bit, as I said already, from Moses Mendelssohn's arrival in Berlin in 1743 until Hitler's rise to power, not even 200 years. A real success story, if you want to call it that. Like in other communities we've seen, whether it's in Krakow in the 16th century, 250 years from the mid-10th to the turn of the 12th, 13th century in Spain, we saw a couple weeks ago, or last week, I should say. The second period, unfortunately for more of us, I think is more familiar, the dark years of the Shoah, from Hitler's appointment to chancellor in January of 1933 until the end, really, of the war in May of 1945. Only 150 years where Hitler basically turns 180 degrees against all those rights and privileges and opportunities that were given to the Jews from starting with Mendelssohn's arrival in the city. And then, as I said, the most complicated period of this session, and that is how one deals with Jewish life in Germany. Can there be Jewish life in Germany after the Shoah? Two, the growth in the Jewish community, particularly from the former Soviet Union and Israel in the past 2.5 decades. And finally, the relationship between Israel and Germany. We just celebrated a few years ago the 50th anniversary of that in 2015. Again, my daughter, she was in the army at the time, and at the major infantry training base in the Negev, she was with her soldiers, teaching them to be reconnaissance infantry soldiers. And during the course, there was a joint Israeli-German war kind of training exercise between the German army and the Israeli army. And I'll never forget asking my daughter about her weekend. She said it was amazing. They're the most unbelievable, systems and vehicles compared to what we, poor Israelis had. But to think that 75 years, in that case, it was 70 years after the Shoah, the German army and the Israeli army are training on desert sand of the Negev was pretty crazy. And finally, issues of memory and Teshuva, particularly in Germany. Berlin, again, very iconic. I'm sure I don't know how many of you have been there. My guess is more of you have been to Berlin than probably to Poland, definitely to Russia. Berlin and Spain, I think, are more accessible. Maybe it's linguistic. But again, as I said, with Spain, it's 500 years after the expulsion. This is in some, maybe of your people who are participating today, some of your lifetime, 1933 to 1945. The city has changed in a very short period, a number of kind of monikers, whether it was the city of enlightenment in the 18th century. And I oftentimes say when I talk about the Shoah that the hardest thing, for me at least, when dealing with the Shoah is the recognition that the Shoah took place in the heart of Christian civilized Europe. And that was Berlin, more perhaps than any other place in Europe at the time. It was the capital, the roaring capital of Weimar from 1919 after the First World War until 1933. The capital of the Third Reich, where Hitler wanted to build his 1,000-year empire with his capital of Germania designed by Albert Speer in the center of Berlin. It was also the frontier city of the Cold War, and of course, the capital of New Europe. And we see what's happening in the world today. We talk about leadership in the world and leadership vacuums, maybe. It's incredible to realize that the leader of Germany, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, on certain levels, when it comes to coronavirus leadership and funding for society, for Germany to get through the financial crisis of Corona, and further funding for the European Union and weaker, poor countries in the EU, together with her kind of visceral response to take in a million refugees from the Middle East a few years ago. She had a lot of criticism for that. So we talk about where Germany is today in Europe, and it's a very different place than it was not that long ago. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I was with a group from Milwaukee. Oh, I can tell you when it was. October 2016. It was just before the elections in the United States. And it was a group from the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. And we're sitting in the American Embassy, which you see the Brandenburg Gate here on the right, just to the left over there is the American Embassy, with the American ambassador, because one of the women in the group had been the President Obama's ambassador at large to combat anti-Semitism. And we were talking with the ambassador, who was very optimistic about the elections. He was wrong in October of 2016. And I realized I looked out over my shoulder to the left, and I looked out the window and I saw the Brandenburg Gate, and I said, wow, this is so much a part of my identity in the 20th century. Those images of the SS stormtroopers walking through there in the spring of 1933, the image in 1989 of the Cold War ending and the wall coming down, the image of President Reagan saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. This was the epicenter of so many of those events that are so formative in Western civilization in the not too distant past. And of course, today, it's one of the more iconic images of Germany, of Berlin, and Europe, I think. And that Brandenburg Gate is actually, if you look at the map, let me put my red pointer on so you can see it a little bit better. These are maps I've taken again from Martin Gilbert. And it's a book, it's called The Holocaust Journey. It's with the students, the late Martin Gilbert, I should say, across Europe. And here you can kind of see, this is the place where the Brandenburg Gate was, just over there. Everything to the right of that was East Berlin. You can see this dark line over there was the Berlin Wall, which I remind you only existed from 1961 to 1989. See the great movie Bridge of Spies, whatever it was, with Tom Hanks a few years ago, about the Gary Powers falling down and the exchange of spies. It's a great period as the wall is being built, right? At that time, just before the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s. This, therefore, is West Berlin. That was all part of West Germany until 1989 of the reunification. And if you look at this map on the left-hand side, this map here is in East Berlin. And that is the blow-up of this area over here, called the Mitte, or the central part of East Berlin, which is really the central part of the city from a German point of view. The Unter den Linden, the main kind of street, with the Night Watch sculpture over here, and the main museums up over here, and the cathedral up over here as well. And interestingly enough, the most important Jewish neighborhood, late 19th century, really throughout the 1800s and up until the early 20th century, kind of like the Lower East Side in New York, kind of like the East End in London, where Jewish immigrants from the East moved and settled, and those, once they finally were able to be more financially independent, moved to the western parts of Berlin, where, interestingly enough, from 45 to 89, there were two Jewish communities, one in Eastern Berlin, which sat on top of where the largest part of Jewish real estate and the Jewish history in Berlin was, and the newer but more affluent Jewish community on the western side. One last picture, if you can see here on the map, there is Wannsee. In the bottom map, I'm looking now with the red cursor, and if you can see me moving up and down, a lake in southwestern Berlin within the city concept. And there is the place, the Memorial House of the Wannsee Conference, and two doors down, was the house of one of the more prominent Jews, who we will meet in just a few minutes' time when we get there. When did Jews first come to Berlin? Really, about 700 years ago, but only by toward the end of the 17th century. There were only about 50 Jews from Vienna who were allowed there. Protected Jews, Schutzjuden, similar to the story we've heard in other places, invited in by the rulers. It was important for the rulers from a business point of view. We were allowed to worship, but only in private homes. We paid heavy taxes. More Jews coming in by 1700. What's more Jews? only 1,000 in a very, very clear defined area, again in Mitte, that part of what was East Berlin, up until 1989. They were quite successful. And it was in 1743 when Moses Mendelssohn walked through the gate reserved for Jews and animals. And at that time, there were only 2,000 Jews inside of the city. There's a book that I highly recommend if you want to do any further study about the Jewish story in Berlin, in Germany, specifically in Berlin, and that is The Pity of It All by the late Israeli author Amos Elon. And Amos, not to be confused with Amos Oz. Amos Elon was a journalist and a writer of history and biography, not fiction. Amos Oz, both late. Amos Oz was primarily an author of fiction, but also a political polemicist. But he writes this amazing book, The Pity of It All, 2002, A History of Jews in Germany, 1743 to 1933. And I've kind of subtitled this from Mendelssohn's arrival through the gate reserved for animals and Jews, paying a head tax, to the success of one of the more important German Impressionist painters, Max Liebermann. There's one of his paintings on the right-hand side, who really manages to reach the highest levels of German society by 1933. And in the introduction to his books, he describes, you can see this here, sorry. He describes, I gotta move this. He says, from the days of Mendelssohn until the rise of Nazism, a story of such promise, but also so vexed, so tangled, and ultimately so terrible. The duality of German and Jew, two souls within a single body, would preoccupy and torment German Jews throughout the 19th and first decades of the 20th centuries. In other words, the challenge that Jews, I think, feel in America today. Are you an American Jew or a Jewish American? And it depends on who's asking, and it depends on where you are in life and the time of the year they're asking, right? That's why Thanksgiving, by the way, apropos what the rabbi and I were saying in the beginning, is so popular amongst the Jews in America. Because Thanksgiving is an opportunity for Americans to give thanks for being Americans. Not for the birth of Jesus, and not for the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, or not for the exodus from Egypt, right? These are universal ideas. And the Jews in Germany were very much, I think, like the Jews in America today, two souls within a single body. And there's a beauty to that, but there's also a challenge to that. And that is really the crux of the book of Amos Elon, and I strongly, strongly suggest it, right? Jews were not wanting to be in Germany. And remember, Germany didn't become Germany, by the way, until 1871, but to be part of and contribute to German culture and language. Think of the Jews in Spain, similar, different than the Jews in Poland, I should say. Each country a little bit different, but there are a lot of similarities. And remember last week when we visited Spain together, and I said how the Jews the historians in Germany in the 19th century looked to Spain, and they were the ones, the German Jews in the 19th century, who coined the term the Golden Era in Spain, because that's the way they wanted it to be, just like those people. Mendelssohn ultimately sets in motion the Enlightenment. And Mendelssohn, quote, said that we as Jews should adopt the habits and constitution of the land in which we live, but retain the religion of our forefathers. And in many ways, Mendelssohn in the mid-18th century, and later on toward the end of the 18th and the early 19th century, the second process of emancipation, and this, what many people refer to 1-2 punch of enlightenment and emancipation. We in the Jewish world, in Israel and outside of Israel, are products of that very, very creative period. And I think it's important for us to recognize that that process began in Germany when Jews, led by Mendelssohn at the beginning and others followed, were able to, because the larger society allowed us to, of course, engage in intellectual conversation and creativity with the larger majority population. Only in 1871, with the unification of Germany, were all restrictions on civil and political rights removed from Jews. Jews basically were German in every possible way, shape, and form, whether it's language, dress, national sentiment. And then, as Elon says, there has rarely been a confluence of two cultural, ethnic, or religious traditions that proved so richly creative at its peak. And they're names of very important, illustrious Jews. Given the Jews' late entry into European civilization, the wealth and variety of their contribution to the arts and sciences was startling. And I think Berlin, more than, well, any other place in Europe, it was this very, and we haven't got to Vienna and Budapest, but when I talk about Vienna and Budapest, it's the same thing. In a very, very short period, Jews are allowed in, and there's this meteoric rise. Really, because we've been denied entry into everything, whether it's the university, whether it's infinite number of professions, we've been denied entry, and all of a sudden we're allowed in. We're going to do as best as we possibly can. He comes, Mendelssohn, into Berlin 1743. He was a young boy, 14, 15 years of age. And he wanted to end, as he said, the age-old social intellectual isolation of Judaism. He, by the way, never gave up Jewish tradition. He was a, quote, Orthodox guy until his end, self-taught guy, learned a large number of languages, passionate about social justice. And he, of course, interacted with, learned from, and taught many, many German intellectuals. The famous story of his defeating Immanuel Kant in a mathematics competition. He couldn't win the prize because the Kaiser wouldn't allow a Jew to actually win the prize. And he really was that seminal figure of the Enlightenment, or as we call it, the Haskalah in Hebrew. He founded a school, the Jewish Free School. Offshoots were founded in places like London and other sites in Europe, which was, keep in mind, we're talking toward the end of the 18th century, a school that would teach people Jewish tradition learning as well as a general education. It was revolutionary. And we saw that in Russia. Now, in the early 19th century, the Russian czars wanted the Jews by coercion to study in, quote, secular schools, versus Mendelssohn saying, do both. Live in both worlds. Think of the modern Orthodox world, Torah v'avodah, right? Torah v'madah, I should say. Torah and science, that's the slogan of the Yeshiva University. He translated the Bible into German. Not all traditional Jews like that. He wasn't the first, by the way. Jews in Alexandria translated the Tanakh into Greek 2,200 years ago. And he's oftentimes referred to as, the Jewish Socrates, but his ideas, and speaking to a Reformed community as a member of a Reformed community in Israel today, he in many ways was the kind of the founding voice in Reform Judaism. Unfortunately, most of his descendants didn't end up being Jewish. His grandson, famous composer Felix, was baptized at the age of 7. Heinrich Heine refers to him as the Luther of Judaism, right? Luther overthrows the monarch or the monopoly of Catholicism and its stranglehold on access to scripture. Similar process Heinrich Heine describes vis-a-vis Moses Mendelssohn, and the kind of loosening up some of the shackles, as he referred to it, as traditional Judaism. There is his grave. Unfortunately, it's not the actual grave, it's a matzevat, it's a memorial stone. There it is in German on the right, in Hebrew on the left. But it's interesting what it says in Ponitman in Hebrew, Rav Moshe Mendelssohn, etc. So it's only got the Hebrew inscription and the German inscription, but the cemeteries you can see around, it's there on Grosshamburger Strasse Street in East Berlin. But unfortunately, the cemetery was destroyed during the Second World War, and we don't know exactly where he's buried, but it's a very important tombstone because, again, Mendelssohn was the seminal figure. And if you look at any of these other communities, go back to Poland, right? We talked about the synagogue being built in Warsaw, Tolmaki, I pronounce it, street synagogue, or the synagogue in the Temple Synagogue, right? That beautiful gold red, for those who remembered, synagogue in Krakow. The quote reform, right? The idea of having music, the idea of the sermon being delivered in the lingua franca of the society, all of these ideas that really began to germinate with Moses Mendelssohn. Very, very important figure. There's the high school that he founded. The building is still there from the 19th century. It wasn't destroyed by the Germans or even by the Allied bombings. Today, there are a little less than 450 students, about 60% of whom are Jewish, which means that 40% of them are not, which is fascinating. High quality, a school in the eastern side of Berlin as we speak today. It became, under Mendelssohn and other great minds from across Germany, came eventually settled in Berlin. Keep in mind, there were 2,000 Jews mid-18th century. 100 years later, there are almost 10,000 Jews. We talked about the full emancipation, 1871. And it's something that whenever I go to Berlin, I always remind, whether I'm with a Reform or conservative synagogue or a federation, that the idea of Reform Judaism, the real founder, I mean, the progenitor of change within Judaism that led to Reform, conservative, and modern Orthodoxy was, of course, Moses Mendelssohn, dealing with that challenge of how do you live both a traditional Jewish life in and living in the modern world in conversation with that modern world. And it's the three great figures of Avram Geiger, who founds the Society for the Study of Judaism, we call it Judaic Studies, and eventually Reform Judaism, Zacharias Frankel, who founds conservative Judaism and modern Orthodoxy under Samson Raphael Hirsch, were in Germany, and all of them were at Berlin at various times. It's fascinating because when you open your Gunter Platt translation in the synagogue of the Torah, generally you'll hear commentary, not just of Rashi from 900 years ago from Germany, France and Germany, but you'll also hear of Raphael Hirsch, the founder of modern Orthodoxy. There began to be an increase in intermarriage in the late 19th century. It became the center of Hebrew culture. People like the founder Zalman Shokin, the founder of the Haaretz newspaper, who relocates to Palestine in the 1920s, is there. And a number of very important Hebrew writers moved there for a while before they come here to Palestine. And really in that period, up in the Weimar years, there were 160,000 Jews, significant growth, one of the more important, maybe a little bit fewer than Budapest and Vienna at the time. And in 1933, about a little bit more than 40% of the Jews, 100,000 of them left between 33 and 39. And why did some stay? Because they thought that, as Elon says, those had this feeling that the horrors that they were experiencing were transitory. And we know in 2020 what happened, but there was no way, I believe, and we could argue about this for a long time, there's no way that the Jews in Germany had any possible way of fathoming what would happen in March of 1942 in a place called Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. There were a little bit less than 10,000 who managed to stay in Berlin, some as kind of U-boats, fake identities, hiding, some married to non-Jews as well. But kind of a little bit of background as to how we got there. We saw in a number of cities already significant, very large synagogues built. This one, perhaps the most significant in Berlin, the Oranienburger Strasse synagogue, not too far from where Rabbi Susan was staying with her daughter last year. Beautiful. This is on the right, redone in the past 20, 25 years. Beautiful. You see it from up on the telecom tower in Alexanderplatz in East Berlin. You see it from on top of the Bundestag, the Reichstag building, which houses the Bundestag. It's beautiful. And it really is this kind of Moorish style of a building. There it is in the 19th century. Again, proof of a community that has made it, that is, A, has the resources, and B, wants to show the larger society a little bit more that it feels comfortable in that society. Now, it was built in the 1860s, Moorish style, like the Doheny Synagogue, some of you have seen in Budapest, like the Choral Synagogue, quite a bit bigger than in St. Petersburg, Russia, Florence, etc. The Tomaki Street Synagogue, similar, and of course the Central Synagogue and Isaac Wise Synagogue in Cincinnati. I don't know of any LA congregations. I don't even know if any LA congregations were built at that time. We're talking 1860 to 1890. There was this fad of a number of synagogues built in that style. Over 3,000 people could fit into it. When it was inaugurated, Otto von Bismarck, no more, no less, right? The president of Prussia, who eventually unifies in 1871 all of the 16 or so states into what we call Germany today. And it miraculously is one of the few synagogues that survived Kristallnacht in 1938, which we just commemorated a few weeks ago. And ironically, in East Berlin, it was heavily damaged by the Allied bombings toward the end of the Second World War, and it fell into East Berlin up until 1989. And there was a small Jewish community there, but the building was really in horrible, derelict condition, only rebuilt, as I said, in the past generation. And I've been there a number of times and joined a small, I forget her name, a female rabbi, ordained in Europe, by the way, and she is the leader of an egalitarian Masorti conservative synagogue that meets there every Shabbat, and of course for all of the holidays. We talked about this kind of meteoric journey from Mendelssohn's arrival until what I said, reaching the peak or the apex probably under Max Liebermann. Liebermann was an incredible impressionist painter. He lived in a townhouse adjacent to Brandenburg Gate, and there's a great story in Amos Elon. He describes how when visitors would come to Berlin and they wanted to see the great Herr Liebermann, they would ask, where he lived. And said, well, you go to the Brandenburg Gate, and if you're coming from the west, you just turn left. If you're coming from the east, just before you get to the gate, and it's the building that is adjacent to the Brandenburg Gate. That is where he and his family lived. So he was obviously quite successful financially, but he was elected to the Prussian Academy of Arts, and then he becomes its president 20 plus years later. He resigned in 1933, shortly after Hitler came to power, and Jewish art was no longer allowed to be displayed. And he famously said, when looking out his window, literally, he saw that famous image that we've all seen, that movie, a horrible movie of German stormtroopers walking under the arch. It was a recreated movie after the fact. I could not possibly eat as much as I would like to throw up. He continues to live there and spends more of his time at the villa in Lake Wannsee, which is 2 doors down from where they have the final solution in 1942. Incredible painter. But when he dies in 1935, no non-Jews really show up at his funeral. And to imagine, a guy who was the chairman, the president of the Prussian Academy of Arts, a great figure in the world of art, nobody shows up outside of the Jewish community at his funeral. Pretty tragic. His wife was ultimately sent away to Auschwitz, I think, in not Auschwitz. She was murdered. And it says here where she was deported in one of these stumbling stones that we'll talk about a little bit later. So the Liebermanns really symbolize, Max Liebermann symbolized the success. There's a picture of him. On the right is a painting that he made of von Hindenburg. And on the left is one of his many self-portraits. There's a large collection of his art. If you come to Israel at the Tel Aviv Art Museum, an amazing painter to say the least. But right around the corner, there is a painting by no more, no less than Liebermann himself, the beer garden on Lake Wannsee. And here is a photograph from when I was there in the summer, I guess a couple of years ago, looking out to Lake Wannsee. From where I'm standing is basically on the back porch of the Wannsee Villa, where they had the conference in January of 1942. And you might recognize this picture on the right, because if you've seen the movie, what's the movie? The Israeli TV series on Netflix about the 4-part series about the girl who leaves the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community, somebody remind me, in Brooklyn, and moves over to somebody, I see the message.
Unorthodox.
Thank you. And when you see the protagonist in Unorthodox, Rifki, whatever her name is, I remember the actor's name, Shira, very successful Israeli actress. She's also in Shtisel. And in that scene in Unorthodox, when she arrives in Berlin and she meets these young people in the music scene, and they say, let's go, we're going to a picnic. And she's trying to go into the water, and this whole big spiritual experience for her, in a sense, I see it as the reverse mikveh, but you can talk about that later, Rabbi. And then one of the Germans says to her, oh, and you see across the way, there's a building over there, and that is where in January 1942, they planned the final solution. It's kind of a crazy scene. Anyway, that's January 42. The second part I mentioned, 1933, 1945, the Shoah. I think for further reading, the best source is by the Israeli, but I think he's now in San Diego. But he's originally from Czech Republic, lived in Israel for many years. Shaul Friedlander, kind of a 2-part book. You can download it on Kindle in 1 part today, The Years of Persecution and then The Years of Extermination. And she says, few German Jews sensed the implication of the Nazi edicts in terms of long-range terror. Nobody in the Jewish community really had the ability to understand what was going to come 8.5 years after Hitler came to power. There were lots of supporters of National Socialism in Germany. I mean, not a majority, there were a significant number, I should say, in the churches and the universities, but they were more in favor of a national revival. There were more people, I should say, in favor of a national revival, making Germany great again, literally, the Third Reich, because there were other periods. I'm not quite sure what he was referring to, Hitler, but to make Germany a great leader once again. And that quote, which is at the entrance to Yad Vashem, I think is very telling. And that is, a country is not just what it does, but it's also what it tolerates. In other words, the idea that a country behaves according to how it should be judged, not just by its behavior, but by what it's willing or its society is willing to put up with, I think is very, very important. And it's not just a lesson for Germany, but it's a lesson, I think, universally and timelessly throughout. I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm just looking at my time, but the thing that's important to remember is that Hitler took power, or was given power, I should say, by von Hindenburg in January of 1933. After his party won more votes than any other party, there was a slippery slope that kind of led to this totalitarian regime. They staged the burning of the parliament. They then banned the largest opposition party. They went to another election where they got 44% of the vote. And just as you know, in your recent experience in the past 3 weeks in America, democracy is fragile and there are different ways of interpreting election results, okay? What happened in Germany was that all of a sudden, by 3 months into it, Hitler was given these enabling acts, which basically gave him dictatorial extra parliamentary powers for 4 years. And that essentially led to all sectors of society and began the persecution of Jews, making it forbidden eventually for Jews not to practice law and medicine, etc., not to teach in universities. Hindenburg dies and Hitler becomes the chancellor and the president. united under this new title of the Führer. The Nuremberg Laws, 1935. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I want you to realize that a lot of events happen in a not that long period, including the Olympics, by the way, 1936. And why do I include the Olympics? Because nobody boycotted the Olympics. Jews weren't allowed to compete, but no country said, and that's why that quote of Yad Vashem, remember, a country should not just be judged by what it does, by what it, but also by what it tolerates. The world tolerated this 3.5-year slippery slope from January 33 to 1936. And what happened? Jews are encouraged to leave Germany. But where do they go? Look at this famous painting by Felix Nussbaum, a German Jew who's studying in Rome. In 33, he's forced to go back. His scholarship is no longer honored by the Reich. He's forced to go back to Germany. He eventually leaves Germany, hides in Belgium, is captured, and in 1944 is murdered in Auschwitz. But an amazing surrealist painter. I mean, he could have been possibly as great as Salvador Dali had he not have been murdered at too young an age. But here he is, the Jew in Germany, his hands, his head in his hands, his worldly belongings, the map of Europe, and the rest of the world out there, symbolized by these dead or dying trees and these vultures waiting, because the world closed its doors to the Jews. So Hitler encourages the Jews to leave, but where are they going to go? A and B, they did not know what eventually was going to happen. The slippery slope continues. The peace, the attempt to appease Hitler with Chamberlain in 1938, Kristallnacht, November 1938, Night of Burning Glass, thousands of Jews arrested, hundreds of Jews of synagogues destroyed, Torah scrolls burned. 1939, the Ribbentrop-von Molotov Pact, Germany and Russia agreed to divide up Poland. They invade Poland, and most of the world doesn't say boo. Well, Britain gets involved, but America definitely did not get involved. It took till Pearl Harbor, I remind you. December 1941 for America to be involved. Operation Barbarossa only begins in the summer of 1941, intentional mass murder, where Jews are first killed by these killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen. We talked briefly about them, I think, in the previous week. Operation Reinhard, the establishment of Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor in Poland, 1941. And only in January of 1942, at that beautiful villa where I took those pictures from, do you actually have the plan for the final solution put forward at this place. Another picture of it here, of this villa. 2-3 doors down from Max Liebermann's house on this beautiful lake. There is this villa. Pictures I've taken, simple pictures of my phone, in the winter, in the summer, stunning. And right there, it was supposed to be December 8th, 1941. But December 7th, 41, Pearl Harbor happens. America joins the war, and the Germans say, we're going to delay this conference, initiated by Hitler, but Heydrich, number 3, kind of the Nazi hierarchy, was supposed to chair that meeting, an hour and a half or so, a meeting. And in that meeting, without a clear smoking gun of a clear protocol, but it's quite clear that in that meeting, according to the author of a book, Mark Roseman, the American historian, Wannsee Conference, he says the following, and this to me is the most chilling thing, because look at the building. It's beautiful. You see the grass of, so I can go back. You see the image of it's too far back, don't worry about it. You see the beautiful image of the grass and the lake. It's stunning. And the tension between the beauty of nature, for me, and the evil of humanity is so palpable. Listen to what Roseman says. Even if not itself the deciding moment, because it's quite clear mass murder began in June of 41 with the Einsatzgruppen in Eastern Europe. Wannsee remains a powerfully symbolic one. Here was the distinguished ambiance of an elegant villa in a cultivated suburb in one of Europe's most sophisticated capitals. Here were 15 educated, civilized bureaucrats from an educated, civilized society observing all due decorum. And here was genocide going through on the nod. They crossed the T's and dotted the I's of this ideological program to remove the Jews who they viewed as the reason that Germany was not in a situation that Germany should actually be in. So putting the first 2 parts aside of the success, very briefly, and I don't do justice, obviously, to 200 years of success, from Moses Mendelssohn coming into Berlin to Max Liebermann being the president of the Prussian Society of Arts. Chapter 2, the briefest, because unfortunately we're most familiar with that, the story of 33 to 45. And I mentioned already a month ago when we were in Poland and together. And I talked about Auschwitz-Birkenau, and I talked about the argument between the historians over the intentionalists and the functionalists, right? How did you get to the final solution? Was it Hitler's intention at the beginning, or was this process, which I believe, a long drawn out process from January 30th, 1933 until really 41, 42. That's 8.5 years until intentional mass murder begins. But it's the third part, I think, in the next 15, 20 minutes, right, or maybe 20 minutes before I turn it over to questions, that to me is the most significant. And that is the question of the present, 1945 until 2020. A couple of years ago, I got in the mail my Foreign Affairs magazine, and the title story was The Undead Past, How Nations Confront the Evils of History. And it looks at America and Germany. The lead story is Germany and Russia and China and a few other countries, about how it uses its history to kind of figure out where it is in the present and how to confront the dark episodes, right? I know all of you are going to be celebrating on Thursday night, hopefully with limited family, unfortunately, Thanksgiving. But how many of you are going to be celebrating the following day? It is the Native American Day or something, right? Probably most Americans don't celebrate that. But in many ways, if you read the Foreign Affairs article online about America, that's kind of what it talks about. Whereas in Germany, it's very different. As the article says, Germany has accomplished, and again, this is the cover story and the lead story of this entire issue of Foreign Affairs dedicated to how nations confront the evils of their history, it should say. A collective acceptance of moral responsibility for the terrible crimes of its recent past. Now, in Jewish tradition, by the way, this is a bracket, this is Mike, not Foreign Affairs, we do not hold fathers responsible for the sins of their children and children responsible for the sins of their fathers, and mothers and daughters, obviously. And so we can't blame young Germans today for what their grandparents might or might not have done. But it's incredible that young Germans feel a sense of responsibility, not to atone necessarily for what their parents and grandparents' generation did, but to remind humanity of what happened. The country has given material expression to this acceptance by preserving physical traces of the Nazi era and building fresh memorials to its victims. Unprecedented, and you'll see that in a few minutes. A new generation of young Germans, born during or after the war, brought up in a very opaque, I should say, democratic society, began to demand the truth about the Nazi era from their parents and teachers. And such physical reminders of the crimes of Hitler and the Nazis confront Germans every day. When it comes to accepting the signs of the past, there is, in the end, no alternative for Germany. Now, there is an alternative for Germany, by the way. It's called AfD. It's a far-right ultranationalist party, by the way. And in the last elections in Germany, they gained more seats than anywhere else. And then there's one of the areas in Germany where they actually are one of the more significant in one of the 16 states that make up the Federation of Germany. There's significant AfD politically represented. And so that tension in democracy and not democracy is something that is constantly played out more in Germany, I think, perhaps than in any other country in Europe today. And largely because of the responsibility of what their parents and what their grandparents did. We're going to look at a handful briefly of memorials. The biggest and one the most photographed you've probably seen is the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. Some refer to it as the Holocaust Memorial. It's not. And think about, I'll go more into that in just a minute. The Bebelplatz, the site of the book burning, designed by an Israeli artist. The site, July 17, where 50,000 Jews were sent and transported to be murdered over a little less than 3.5 years. Thousands of those stumbling stones. We saw one in honor of the wife of Max Liebermann a few minutes ago. And in a rural residential area, the Bavarian Quarter, one of the most subtle, but I think powerful memorials. And then the Wannsee Villa, which we've already explored, okay? This is a memorial. If you've been to Berlin, you might have noticed it. It's on the outside the Friedrichstrasse station, which today houses a museum to the period during which Berlin was divided. This was the place where people would go from west to east Berlin. They would switch trains in the Friedrichstrasse station. And it's a memorial designed by the late Danzig-born Israeli artist, Frank Meisler, who had a studio in Jaffa. And it's dedicated to the Kindertransport. There are a series. There's one here, and there is one in the Liverpool Street Station in the East End of London as well, because that's where the Jewish children who were sent from Germany and Czechoslovakia to England, largely, were saved and were protected. And it's a very, very powerful image that many people, I think, who walk through the station don't even notice it's there, but it's there. And as Foreign Affairs said, young Germans are confronted with this on a daily basis. A little bracket, because we're not going together to Prague, but in Prague, there's a memorial in the train station there dedicated to Nicholas Winton. Some of you might have heard of him. British righteous amongst the nation who saved 669 children from Europe, mostly from Czechoslovakia, and sent them over to England. And he didn't publicize the story until decades later. His family, while they were looking through old boxes in the attic, found his correspondence telling about the story. And you've seen the video, I'm sure, on YouTube. This guy sitting in the audience, a woman's on the stage and says, and I'd like to thank you, Mr. Winton, for saving my life because you helped arrange my safe passage from whatever. And he says, is there anybody else here in the audience who, so the entire audience stands up. It's a very powerful moment. 669 children were saved. I remember that because the unit that my youngest son is in the Air Force is Unit 669. It is the search and rescue unit of the Israeli Air Force, which honors and perpetuates the memory of the righteous acts of the late Sir Nicholas Winton in saving children. So you see that, and you're going to a train station. What are kids without parents there doing with their bags? The Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, as I said, oftentimes called the Holocaust Memorial. It's not. It says, there's no sign that says that there, by the way. It's just these 2,711, you can count them, but that's the number, of slabs that are situated in the most expensive part of Berlin. It was an area that was no man's land. It took about 15 years post-1989 collapse of the wall, because where these trees are is where the Berlin Wall was. This long building on the picture on the left is the American Embassy. The flags over there are the flags on that Sir Norman Foster redesigned dome of the Reichstag building, in which the German parliament, the Bundestag, sits. And you can't quite see it, but because it's just on the other side of the American Embassy. But actually, you might be able to see the quadriga. This is, I think, part on the left-hand side of the Brandenburg Gate. So you know where you are. This is a Frank Gehry office building over here, more of the American Embassy on the right. And it's this very eerie memorial. Watch a video on it. It's fascinating because the ground isn't stable. Each stone is a slightly different size. Some people say it reminds them of a matzeva, of a tombstone. And underneath there's a museum, which very limited access, it's not that big, which chronicles stories of a number of families who were transported across Europe to be murdered during the final solution. And you kind of hear the stories there, but there are no names, and it's huge. And it's right there in the center of what was the largest building site in Europe for many, many years, from the Frank Gehry office building and the redone American Embassy, where the photographer standing, if you're looking behind the picture, is an area called the Alexanderplatz, which is a very, very, not Alexanderplatz, it'll come back to me, but the area that was, again, right in kind of no man's land between East and West Berlin. No, the Alexanderplatz is further east, sorry. It'll come back to me. It's where the Sony Center is, and large, and lots of very nice hotels as well. And that's a statement that Germany took 15 years after the reunification. Remember, Berlin wasn't the capital. Bonn was the capital of West Germany, and they had this discussion, and they decided that Berlin would be the new capital. And not only does it become the new capital, but it becomes the center of lots of stories that remind Germans and visitors what happened. We are standing, whoever took this picture, this one on the right is mine, this one on the left is from the internet. I'm standing very close to where Hitler's bunker was, where he took his life, end of April of 1945. It's right in the center of Berlin. About a mile from there, along that Unter den Linden, the main street, is something called the Bebelplatz, in front of the opera on one side, and on the other side, the museum, the library of the law faculty of the university. And it's amazing is that this memorial is underground. There's the square, and it's hard to see, but they're empty bookshelves designed by the Israeli artist Mike Hollander on the place where books were burned in the spring of 1933, taken from libraries in the university. And Stefan Zweig, the Austrian Jewish writer, who eventually leaves Austria, goes to America for a while, eventually takes his life in South America. He describes the whole process of this book burning, and don't read the whole quote. Just at the end, he says, I regard it as more as an honor than a disgrace to be permitted to share the fate of the complete destruction of literary existence in Germany. I'll read that sentence again. And he's writing this in 43, in his last book, The World of Yesterday, just before he commits suicide. The complete destruction of literary existence in Germany with such eminent contemporaries as Mann, Heinrich Mann, Werfel, Freud, Einstein, and many others whose work I consider incomparably more important, etc. What is he telling us? That this wasn't just burning books. This was the complete destruction of literary existence. And what does that mean? As the quote we oftentimes hear from, it's the quote that is on the pavement next to Ullmann's kind of empty bookshelves. And that is the quote by Heinrich Heine in 1820-21, who says, in a place where books are burned, don't be surprised if people will be burned as well. And that was a prophecy that came true. 1933, the books were burnt. 1941, 42, 43, many, many, many millions of Jews were burnt in Europe. On the western edge of the city, in the beautiful neighborhood, not too far from the Israeli embassy, by the way, is a train station, which was used. Jews were essentially marched miles across the city of Berlin. Again, it's a huge city, 5, 7, 8 miles to this place in this leafy neighborhood. And then they were put on trains and 50,000 were sent out to be murdered. But there are a handful of memorials there. And one of the most recent one is this, concrete with shadows. Remember I talked about absence of presence versus presence of absence, both in Krakow versus Warsaw and throughout Spain last week, so too here. The palpable sense that there used to be people here and all we have is their shadows kind of left in the suppression in the concrete is very, very powerful. And then you walk up about 100 meters to the train, which is no longer used. Beyond the trees to the right is a modern active train station. But here you can see all along are flowers on the left-hand side, a few more on the right. And there is steel, and on the steel, the writing of the dates, the destinations of the trains, and how many Jews were on board. And the last trains in early 45 included 20 Jews, 30 Jews, Jews that were caught hiding in Berlin that were then sent out even toward the end of the war to be murdered. So it's a very powerful memorial. And again, it's right in the center of a leafy, affluent Western Berlin neighborhood where people go every single day, live, take the train, and literally see the site. The stumbling blocks you've probably heard of, Stolpersteine, there are about 75,000, initiated by a German artist, Günther Denmig, and they're all over the place. The idea is quite simply that anybody, a resident, an owner of a building today, a descendant of a family, a friend, whoever, or somebody who reads, a kid who reads a book in history and wants to spend 80 euros or whatever it costs today to put one of these down. You can see the artist on the left-hand side putting one down on the pavement, basically giving us whatever biographical information we have about the person who lived there, the dates that they lived there, and what happened to them. They were sent somewhere else. Now, there's controversy. There are certain places in Europe where they don't want to have it. There are certain places where there are many more of them. I don't know how most of us would feel if somebody were to knock on our door today and say, listen, I'd like to put a plaque at the front door of your entrance that says that here lived, I don't know, let's say you lived in a city that used to have Arab families living in it, or a neighborhood in Jerusalem, and say, this is where the Husseini family lived up until they were evicted in the War of Independence. I can understand the challenge that people might have of it, but the fact that 75,000 of them were put up there. And oftentimes, I was in a city in the Czech Republic, Kolín, a number of years ago, with the synagogue from Los Gatos outside of in Silicon Valley. And we spent a weekend there because they had a Holocaust scroll from that community. And there are no Jews left, not a single one. But the mayor has gone out of his way in order to put as many stumbling stones up to commemorate the few hundred small community Jews that lived there up until the war. Very, very powerful. And you literally stumble across these as you walk throughout the city. The last memorial that I want to talk about is this newish memorial in a kind of middle-class neighborhood, not as far west as the Grunewald neighborhood where the Platform 17 memorial is, but it's a neighborhood where a lot of liberal academics, not all liberal, it's kind of iron, but Jewish academics, including Einstein and Walter Benjamin, lived. Almost 20,000 of them lived there. And a number of years ago, 25, almost 30 years ago now, a group of people in the neighborhood, non-Jews, had this grassroots initiative to create these street signs that were kind of put up with an icon on one side and the text on the other side, explaining the significance of that particular icon, where you would learn about various Hitlerian anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish legislation. For example, on one it would say the picture of kids playing, and then in the back it would say Jewish children may no longer attend public schools, or Jews in Berlin can only buy food between 4 and 5 p.m. Of course, back then, if you went to the supermarket at 4, there was nothing left. There was no bread. There were no fruits and vegetables or meat. Everything was gone. It was a war. Jewish veterinarians may not open practices. And I insist on going to this neighborhood when I have groups there. Unfortunately, we don't always get there because there's not enough time. But here you walk through the street and you'll see, again, taking my phone, an image on the left of a loaf of bread. And on the right, I've translated, Jews in Berlin may only buy food between 4 and 5 p.m. And oftentimes people are walking in the neighborhood and they see this. They don't, what's the sign? Is this telling me there's a bakery there? Well, if you go to the other side, you notice there are 80 of these signs that it says, no, something different. Or on the right, a picture of a dog. Well, that's nice. Maybe this is a veterinarian's office. But on the backside, it says, Jewish veterinarians may not open practices. It's crazy. It's subtle, but it is right there as you walk through this very, very nice neighborhood in the Bavarian quarter. In terms of memory, I think there is a tension that I always feel in Berlin between the universality and the particularity of memory. And at the beginning, somebody, I think Eric was his name, mentioned that he has relatives named Hollander from Aachen, Germany. My last name is Hollander. And I've been to Berlin a dozen times now in the past few years. And every time I walk, and I know exactly where it is, on Oranienburger Strasse Synagogue, between the coffee shop and the, we always have our lunch break there, and the synagogue that I showed you, the beautiful golden kind of mortar-style building from the late 19th century. There are a number of stumbling stones. And one says Lotte Hollander, born Gutmann, 1888, deported 1943 to Auschwitz. Where? On the train tracks where we just were at Gleis 17. Could she be a relative of mine? It's the same name, but by me seeing a stone, it does two things. One is, it's a stone that tells me there was an individual who lived there, who was transported on this date in 1943, and it allows me to realize that had I been living there with the same name, that would have been my fate as well, had I have not been able to somehow escape or somehow emigrate from 33 to 39. And on the right-hand side, the anonymity or the universality of memory as expressed inside the Jewish Museum. Again, I had to pick and choose in 75 minutes what to visit and what not to visit. Designed by Daniel Libeskind, the Polish-born Israeli-American architect. He did the kind of square outlines, where the Twin Towers were in New York with the names written all around them. But Libeskind designed this museum. It's a museum of the Jewish story in Germany, but they're voids. He intentionally includes these voids in his building, empty spaces, where in one of the most poignant is a sculpture by an Israeli artist, the late Menashe Kadishman. And Menashe Kadishman, you might, looking on my wall here, I've got a sheep. He's got all these goats. He's the sacrificial goats of one for every Israeli soldier. But Kadishman made these faces, he calls it shalechet, or fallen leaves. And you're encouraged as you visit the museum to walk on these. And it's a very eerie kind of jarring sound as you see these heavy steel faces that you're walking along, because for most of the victims, we don't, I want to say have the good fortune, but have the ability to know who the person was, where they lived, and when they were transported. A couple more slides. I'm looking at my time in terms of when to get to the Q&A. Yehuda Bauer, the former head of Yad Vashem, speaks 1998. So we're talking the 50th anniversary of Israel's independence. He's speaking to the Bundestag. And listen to what he says. And then I'm going to talk about what Angela Merkel says. And then we'll turn it over. I'll summarize and we'll turn it over to Q&A. How is it possible for a people of culture that lived in the midst of Europe and which had developed one of the greatest civilizations ever to subscribe to such an ideology, to instigate a war of annihilation because of it, and to stick to it until the bitter end? There was a consensus that was based on a promise of a wonderful utopia. It was necessary to revolt against everything that had been before, the whole package of the French Revolution and Enlightenment in general. And keep in mind what I said at the beginning. I said, from Mendelssohn, the process of the Enlightenment, and later on, 1871 in Germany, the Emancipation. That 1-2 punch of Enlightenment emancipation was welcoming to the Jews, but for many in Europe, it was the exact opposite, had the exact opposite effect. And unfortunately, the worst example of that was in Nazi Germany. He continues, you, the German people, cannot perform without us the task of remembering. And we must be sure that here, from where the disaster came, an old, new, humane, and better civilization is being constructed on the ruins of the past. We both together carry a very special responsibility to the whole of humanity. The heirs, the perpetrators, and the heirs of the victims must be in this joint act of remembrance together, which I think is very, very powerful. It wasn't always so easy, because it took a long time for David Ben-Gurion to accept from Konrad Adenauer the notion of reparations. It almost led to civil war in Israel. Right? Adenauer in 51 already says, unspeakable crimes have been committed in the name of the German people, calling for moral and material indemnity. Almost civil war in Israel, but the money that Germany gave in the first 2 decades of Israel was so significant in infrastructure projects and was up to 15% of the Israeli gross domestic product. And 55 years after Israel and Germany signed diplomatic relations in 65, Israel and Germany have the strongest in Europe, and maybe outside of America in the world, diplomatic, political, economic, and military relationships and cooperation. Our prime minister is being investigated for questionable actions regarding purchase of submarines. They're submarines produced in Germany that are subsidized by German taxpayers to protect Israel. Why? Because of what Angela Merkel says, the Chancellor of Germany. 10 years ago, speaking on the 60th anniversary in German, in the Knesset, she says, here of all places, I want to explicitly stress that every German government and every German chancellor before me has shouldered Germany's special historical responsibility for Israel's security. The historical responsibility is part of my country's raison d'etre. Now, I said, I believe that America is probably Israel's greatest friend, but I do not know of any American president, Democrat or Republican, who has said the historic responsibility of Israel's security is part of my country's raison d'etre. It isn't a part, I mean, it's a priority for American foreign policy, but it's not part of its raison d'etre, and I think that is very significant. And then, as she describes, she continues, in a later speech, 5 years later, interviewed by an Israeli paper, we're doing this out of an awareness of Germany's constant responsibility for the fracturing of civilization in the time of the Holocaust and an awareness for the shared values and interests. And I will tell you, as someone who hears Hebrew on the streets of Berlin, I have a niece who's working for the Israeli Defense Ministry out of the embassy in Germany. She feels very comfortable there as well. Very deep, very strong relations between the two countries. And with this, 2 more slides, and I'll turn over to Q&A. A review of that 3-sided prism, right? You need to switch your glasses, and maybe for Q&A, you can put your old glasses back on. But I first very quickly went through almost 200 years from Mendelssohn's arrival until Liebermann's success, unprecedented heights in 190 years. 2, the dark years of Nazism and the Shoah, that slippery slope that led from January 33 until the final solution, and kind of the reversing very quickly of those rights and laws that were granted and opportunities to the Jews in the previous century and a half. And finally, the most complicated past 75 years. Can there be Jewish life in Germany after the Shoah? Why are there so many young Israelis living there and feeling comfortable doing so? The influx of Jews in the former Soviet Union, I briefly mentioned, and that complicated but strong and deep relationship between Germany and Israel, as well as issues of how Germany relates to memory and how we, the Jewish people, should relate to Germany and German people doing tshuva, repentance, on behalf of the sins of the generations before them. I'll end with one story that happened to me, a chance occurrence as I was in Berlin. I put it up on Facebook, and a good friend of mine who was with a group from the University of Berkeley, alumni, a travel group, was there. And he said, let's get together for drinks later. And then she texted me, she says, you know what? I have an extra ticket. Why don't you join the group? We're going to the Berlin Concert House. There's a concert tonight, a Beethoven concert. I'm like, yeah, Beethoven. I'll be honest, I'm not that into classic music, but I figured Germany, Beethoven, opportunity right here. It's a couple blocks away. I'll go. So we go. And this is a picture I took inside, beautiful, in the Jean de Market Square. And it turned out it was Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And of course, it was Schiller's Ode to Joy. And again, not being class, I recognized the tune very, very quickly, of course. And it was amazing to me because it was toward the end of my, I think, 8 or 10 days. I was a group from Evanston, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. We're traveling in Germany, not just in Berlin. We ended in Berlin. And that tension that was within me of the evil that was perpetrated there not that long ago, literally on those streets just outside, and the incredible beauty and talent of humanity. And Beethoven, perhaps the most well-known composer, and the beautiful poem Ode to Joy, which is the song of the European Union, a song of celebration, and the incredible potential of humanity for good, for amazing creativity in the field of science and arts and literature and so many other fields, but also the incredible potential of evil of humanity. And in many ways, that's why I think Berlin, to me, is the most exciting place to visit in Europe today, as a Jew, as an Israeli, because, as I say, it tells the story of the cup being much less than half full, but also much more than half open. And the last time I was there, 10 months ago, I was with the group who went to visit Israel Aid, and if you can see in the back there, there is Israel Aid. It's an Israeli not-for-profit organization that provides aid to refugees coming. Let's think about this. Israelis giving money to support refugees coming from Syria and other parts of the Middle East to be settled in Germany. Crazy, but that shows, I think, and it's partly indicative of how far the relationship between Israel and Germany has come in a short 75 years. And with that, I turn it over to Q&A. So I see if somebody asked me the far right influence currently in German elections, please. Good question. Look, everybody, I don't speak German, I don't read German papers, but everybody I'm in contact with in Germany is very concerned with the right of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany party. It is a far right party. Some would say it's a neo-Nazi party. We see protests in Germany today that are connected to our protests over anger over forcing people to wear masks and to closing stores, not too dissimilar from what we see in other countries, including America, in recent days, and they're generally from the far right in Germany. I'm optimistic because although when I was there last, we were in Dresden, and we happened to be there in February. Literally, it was the anniversary of the bombing of Dresden in February of 1945. It was 75 years after the bombing of Dresden, and we were there for one night, we were going to leave the next day, and we left earlier because we were told by the Jewish community there that they were worried about some far-right protests that were happening. There is a rise in the far right on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a recognition by the rest of Germany that this is literally beyond the pale and is unacceptable. And it's amazing that there's very little, there's anti-Semitism from that group, of course, as in America too, by the way, from the far right. And I mean, there's Charlottesburg in America, and there are instances of far-right anti-Semitism in Germany, but because Germany has the experience of the Shoah and the Second World War, the German public is much less willing to stand up for that. You would never hear, and I don't want to get political, but you would never hear Angela Merkel say, listen, there were good people on both sides if there was a protest of the AfD. You wouldn't hear that. I'm not, criticizing other leaders in the world, but it is so beyond the pale. And Holocaust denial is heavily prosecuted, and there's a growing awareness, and there's a very strong awareness of that in Germany. One, Islamic anti-Semitism. You don't have that in Germany. Most anti-Semitic acts perpetrated in Germany, although there is a very significant immigrant community from the Middle East, is from the far right, whereas in places like France or in England, it's a combination, but France, much of the anti-Semitic violence is committed by immigration from the Middle East and North Africa. So it's a very, very, very different reality. And again, I never feel uncomfortable wearing a kippah when I visit. I mean, I don't regularly wear kippah, but if I were walking with the conservative synagogue to shul, I'd wear my kippah, and I wouldn't think twice about it. Somebody asked, when our world returns to normal, how can we sign up for one of your tours? Is this and the other travel archived for us to watch again? That is a question for Susan. Is it archived? I don't know. I'd love to. Susan and I have talked already about non-virtual travel, which means not that we're not traveling, but we're traveling in the flesh and blood. Hopefully soon.
Yes, we're hoping to arrange some trips as soon as we can travel again. Right now, it's not looking good. Maybe next year at this time, or maybe by the summer, we don't know. I will say, I was in Berlin, and I know I'm in the minority, but I'll say it anyway. I did not like that memorial to the murdered Jews at all. I thought it was cold. It was cold. It didn't say anything about Jews. It could have been a memorial to any group. There was nothing Jewish about it. It had no emotion. And I know that was the point in a way, that it was like this impersonal destruction, but it felt, it didn't evoke in me what, you know, the Holocaust Museum in Washington or other memorials I've been to. In Poland, there are amazing memorials. The memorial in Treblinka is one of the most powerful memorials I've ever seen, which, by the way, everyone, it's a sculpture garden in the shape of a cemetery with hundreds of gravestones, but in each gravestone is the name of a town where Jews were killed. And so you look at these 1,000 gravestones.
17,000.
How many?
17,000.
17,000 gravestones, and everyone except for one has the name of a town. So it just breaks your heart. Whereas these, whatever these squares were, just didn't do it for me. There was no writing anywhere about it. So that's
I would say it's probably one of the more talked about memorials, no question. It's huge.
Yeah.
Again, 2,711 massive, massive stones. It's disorienting in that the things are different sizes. As you walk through the terrain, it's not flat, obviously. I mean, I think the Eisenman, Robert, I forget his first name, Eisenman, the American artist who designed it, architect who designed it, his idea was to really get people to ask questions. So there's some memorials, it's pretty obvious what they're commemorating, a train car, for example, and the others that are much more forcing the visitor to engage in them. And I think a lot of the memorials that to me are moving in Germany are those that are just so simple that you have to begin to ask yourself those, like the Wannsee Villa. I can tell you that about half of the groups that I guide, about a month before I look at their itinerary, and the Wannsee Villa isn't on. And I ask the tour operators putting the itinerary together, say, well, it's too far out there, it's not worth the visit. And I said, listen, I think it's worth the visit, let's cut something out. And people always go there, and it's this beautiful place.
right.
And it's this, how do
juxtaposition, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
and I think that's.
I'm in the minority. People are writing in, they love the memorial. So I'm just a personal thing, which is, you bring yourself to everything. Somebody asked, can you provide a list of recommended reading for the past 4 lectures? And maybe you want to email that to me and we could post that if you don't, unless you can off the top of your head.
Without yeah, I mean, I could say that, but I say too slow. What I'll do is I'll look through my 4 presentations that I've done, and I'll look at the major books that I've quoted from, and I'll send them to you guys. And I will again apologize for the huge amount of verbiage. I know anybody who puts presentations together said, "Oh, Mike, there are too many words, so many words." I don't read them all, but I put them there because I think that they're important in terms of telling the story, whether it's quotes from individuals, whether it's Max Liebermann or whether it's Angela Merkel, but also books, because as I say, I hope that this is a teaser more than anything else. 75 minutes on Berlin doesn't do it justice. A week doesn't do it justice, but hopefully I'll give you guys an opportunity to do some further reading beyond this.
There's a question, why 2,711 stones?
It's a very good question, and he hasn't answered it.
Let's
it could
see.
just be with the size. People say, well, there was a mathematics, that there just wasn't enough space for it. But if you look carefully at it, there's some that are kind of sticking out into the sidewalk. So don't know. Could be some, the algorithm of whatever it was. But the amazing thing was it took a long time. I think it was only began in 2003, completed in 2004, and it officially inaugurated in 2005. And keep in mind, the Berlin Wall fell and it was an empty space from 1989 until 2003. So the city and people wanted to do something there, and there were a lot of discussions as to what should be there. There are also some problems in that there are people who are running through it and looking at it as a playground or suntanning on top of it. And there's no real signs about what to do and what not to do, which is, I think, what makes it so powerful. And that it forces the visitor, if you don't know what it is, you walk by and like, what's going on? And so most people, they will pick up their phone and say, where am I? What is this type of thing? But if you do go intentionally to see it, you ask all sorts of questions. Do I like it? How does it make me feel? And I think almost all of those memorials that one sees in Berlin get you to kind of stop, hopefully, ideally, and think and raise questions. And I didn't even talk about this, but the whole, if you go today, I alluded to this. I said the Bundestag, the parliament, sits in the building called the Reichstag that was burned down in March of 33. But the building was redesigned. The dome that was pretty much collapsed since the fire was maybe damaged in the war afterwards, was designed by Sir Norman Foster and is glass, as is the entire chancellery, the office of Chancellor Merkel and her precedents and those who will succeed her. It's all floor to ceiling glass windows, as if to say that democracy should be visible, democracy should be opaque. It shouldn't be these enabling laws that, you know, that Hitler had. And again, it's a lesson that Germany, I think, has learned with huge amounts of blood, not just for itself, but for all of humanity, how to ensure that those dark years don't repeat itself in Germany or anywhere else in the world.
There are a lot of Israeli restaurants in Germany, in Berlin. I ate some really good, yeah, there are a lot of Israelis there. And I
More
went,
Turkish now.
yeah, okay. So people are thanking you so much for this wonderful series. And we are going to be doing more of these in the spring with Mike. And if we have no more questions, we're going to say goodbye for now and happy Thanksgiving to everyone. And we definitely are planning to tour with Mike when the time comes. You have your built-in tour here, Mike. So
God willing, we might need more than one bus though.
That's okay.
Look, it was my pleasure. I thank you all for listening. And I'm sorry if I talked too quickly and if I didn't answer all of your questions. But again, I think more than anything, and to me, it's been very, I can use the word therapeutic, I guess. For me, as someone who spent most of my adult life, all of my adult life as a Jewish educator, and most of my adult life either in Israel or in Europe, taking people to different places. And it goes back to what I said in our opening session, the idea of a journey. And even if we physically can't leave our houses today because of what's going on in the world, just to be able to have that ability to kind of dream, as it were, to think of something that's far away, something you might want to go to. That travel doesn't necessarily have to be based on going from one place to the other. And it's a challenge that I've had to do of how to translate my experience to kind of make it an experience for others. So I really appreciate all of you tuning into these 4 sessions, and I look forward to more sessions on my home turf in Israel in the spring.
Absolutely. Okay, bye everyone. Have a beautiful day. Have a beautiful holiday. And we have to all be thankful for what we have. Look at what we have, be grateful. And Shabbat Shalom as well. Won't see you before then. And goodbye, Mike. Shalom, lehitraot.
Lehitraot. We'll see you on the other side.
Absolutely.
After the inauguration.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye.